Hi, Kim. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here again.
Yeah, we love return guests. So we thought of you when we thought about this topic today. We know that books are your thing. You love to read books and articles and listen to podcasts and learn all about literacy. But today we're going to talk about your top 3 book recommendations. So, do you want to kick us off by just kind of like sharing a little bit about your podcast pairings, your 3 books that we're going to talk about today?
Absolutely. So, as most people know, I have a super cute dog named Ziggy. And so every day I do like a little pup and podcast. I walk him for 45 minutes and listen to a podcast. And 99.9% of the time, it's one of your podcasts. And so I listen to this 45-minute podcast, usually every Friday, sometimes Saturday morning. And it really starts a lot of thinking. And so I listen to this podcast and I become super inspired to learn more about it. And so that often takes me to a website where I find a book or an article or something so that I can continue that learning and deepen my understanding of that topic. So a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to one of your podcasts. It was actually with Dr. Stephanie Stoller, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, I so need to buy this book, The Next Steps." And then I started to explore other things, and basically just did this deep dive into podcast pairings, where I would listen to one of your podcasts and then pair it with a book on the same topic, and that's it.
I
Well,
love that.
people are loving it. I can tell you that on social media. People love your podcast pairings already. I know it's a new thing for you, but they love it. So keep it coming and we'll share some today. So, do
Yeah.
you want to start by sharing your first podcast pairing with a book recommendation?
Absolutely. So, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, that you had Dr. Stephanie Stoller on your podcast, and it was episode 193, Systems to Getting Better Reading Results. And I have been a big fan of Dr. Stephanie Stoller for quite some time. She was so kind to do a guest appearance in my graduate class at Vancouver Island University this past winter and really helped me better understand the multi tiers of support, or the MTSS model. And what really stood out to me in this podcast was giving students not something different. So when students are struggling to read, they need actually a double dose of what should be going on in the regular classroom. And so I think in the past, we used to have this understanding that students who struggled to read needed something different. They needed spec ed, but she helps better understand that kids actually need strong evidence-based instruction in the regular classroom. And then if they are not progressing as we would expect, then we do that tier 2 intervention. And it shouldn't be a large majority of the students. It should be quite a small percentage of the students who need what she calls this double dose. And so she talks about that, but she also really dives into screening and the importance of screening students for risk. And I have this friend and colleague at my school, and I often use this analogy. My friend Joanna, she was recently screened for breast cancer, and so she went into the hospital and they screened her for breast cancer, and she had some interventions done to help prevent the breast cancer. And so when Dr. Stephanie Stoller talks about the multi-tiered systems of support, we really are looking at something similar to that medical model. We want to make sure that we are providing that strong tier 1, but then screening people for risk. And so I wanted to learn more about it. So I bought the Next Steps book, which is written by Susan Smart and Deb Glaser, and it's called Next Steps in Literacy Instruction: Connecting Assessments to Effective Interventions. This is a great book for a book study because it really does a deep dive into that MTSS model, and it talks about how we can effectively teach students in the regular tier 1 classroom, and how we can screen students who are at risk and then provide them with those targeted interventions with specific learning goals too, with specific targeted goals. And then how we should be progress monitoring, which is looking to see if our instruction is working. And if our instruction isn't working, we just don't throw up our hands and say, well, I taught it and they didn't learn it. We have to change our instruction. And I think that is such an important piece for teachers, because sometimes we have this idea that, well, we taught it and they didn't learn it. And so what the MTSS model really emphasizes is, if our instruction isn't working, then we need to change the way we're teaching and really have those high expectations for our students as well. And so I haven't finished this book, but I have scratched the surface of it. I've looked at a few particular chapters, but it is divided in really, really well organized: fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension, phonics. But at the beginning, it really does show the importance of the MTSS model and the 3 tiers of intervention, and really emphasizes that we need to maximize the learning for all students and make sure that we are matching our instruction to their needs.
Yeah, that's one thing I loved about this book too. Was I know that we asked Stephanie Stoller about assessments, and we were like, well, like, tell us about like what's a diagnostic versus a screener, and it gets really confusing, and there's so many assessments. And in each of those chapters you mentioned, she has a chart, or they have a chart, and it really breaks down all the different assessments that you might hear about for each of the different parts of literacy, and tells whether it's a diagnostic, whether it's a classroom-based assessment, whether it's a computer-based assessment. I was like, these charts alone would be so helpful as a teacher.
Absolutely, because I think sometimes teachers feel like they need to reinvent the wheel, and she helps teachers by providing some instructional routines. And I think we need more. Personally, I feel like we need more consistency in terms of what is happening in classrooms, rather than some teachers are, some teachers aren't. And so she does have a lot of great resources that can be printed off. She's got the Acadience Reading Diagnostic Checklist. She has a lot of great templates in here for really strengthening that Tier 1 instruction. And just really at the core of her message, and at the message of this book by Susan Smart and Deb Glaser, is having high expectations for kids and not accepting, well, they're not learning it, and really targeting our instruction to meet students' individual needs.
I love that. And I agree with you about not reinventing the wheel and, using what we have. And if these are really great places to find these things, then let's use them. They're there. So
Absolutely. And she's got some great infographics in here too. I know your viewers can't see it, but she does have her multi-tiered systems of support pyramid. And really she emphasizes that 80% of students should reach their learning goals through Tier 1 classroom instruction, and another 15% should be reaching their goals through Tier 1 and Tier 2. And that's where she really refers to that double dose, because sometimes what I see throughout schools in Ontario, here in Canada, and I'm sure it's happening down in the States too, sometimes kids are getting spec ed instead of classroom instruction. And so we really want to make sure we're doing that double dose, that they're getting that Tier 1 classroom instruction maybe in the first literacy block, and then they're getting that strong Tier 2 also in that classroom environment. And then we can sort of give that extra dose of intensity. We can give that extra dose of repetition and frequency in the small reading remediation groups. But that Tier 2 also doesn't have to be pull out. That can happen in the whole class environment, so that they're not missing that Tier 1.
Such a good point. I'm glad that you mentioned that. So what we'll do as well, just a little side note, is we'll link all these books in the show notes, as well as all the podcasts that we're talking about today too, all of our pairings. Kim, I know one thing that we want to make sure that we share before we move on is a beverage pairing for this book. Did you have a beverage pairing that you wanted to share?
Am I allowed to?
Yeah, we're on summer break.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. So I was thinking podcast Prosecco pairings, because I'm a big fan of Prosecco. So yes,
we should drink Prosecco while we plan for our effective intervention.
MTSS, yes. And then we may have some podcast and pint pairings coming up soon.
Oh,
but
okay.
I
So
do
we'll be on the lookout for those.
highly recommend the Prosecco pairing for this particular podcast. We're starting to really capitalize on the alliterations here.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I'm getting ahead of the next one already in my head. Yeah.
Pups, podcasts, pairings.
But you can't go wrong with Prosecco. It's light and crisp and the perfect summer drink.
I love it. Okay, so Next Steps in Literacy Instruction pairs really well with our MTSS podcast, which was episode 133, and also a nice glass of cold Prosecco. So here we go.
193.
193. All right, so moving into our next recommendation from you, Kim, what is the next book that you recommend reading this summer?
Okay, well, I'm going to take a step back from the next book and just say that a month ago, I attended the Research Ed conference in Toronto, and I heard for the first time Dr. Daniel Willingham speak. He was one of the keynote speakers at the Research Ed conference in Toronto, and I was blown away, not only by the content that he provided, but the fact I didn't know this. And I considered myself to be, a great reader. I feel like I know what to teach. I have done a deep dive into teaching morphology and phonics and phonemic awareness. But what he really focused on was the how we should be teaching and focusing on the learning. So a lot of what I have heard in terms of the science of reading is, well, we need to teach them phonemic awareness. We need to teach them how to blend, segment. We need to teach them morphology and the meaningful parts of words. We need to teach them reading fluency. And sometimes teachers are saying, well, I taught it, and they still can't do it. So I was really inspired after Dr. Willingham's keynote address at the Research Ed, and I thought, I need to start focusing on how to teach to make learning more effective. And so, of course, on my next Pups and Podcast walk with my dog, I listened to podcast episode 139. And this was a podcast that you had with Dr. Willingham and Barbara Davidson, who's the executive director of the Knowledge Matters campaign. And this was such a great episode because it essentially was building my background knowledge on a topic I wasn't yet familiar with. And what they really focused on and what they talked about was the role of background knowledge and how students need to know a lot about a little. And he has this saying, 1,000,000 miles wide. I'm going to say that again, 1,000,000 miles wide and not very deep. And he was talking about how we need to make sure that we are, my analogy is creating that Velcro for other information to stick to. And we all know that quote from Dr. Natalie Wexler, background knowledge is like the Velcro for new knowledge to stick to. And so they were really focusing on the importance of building students' background knowledge and the role of background knowledge, not just in literacy, but in other subject areas too. And so, of course, I always relate to my own teaching. And I'm thinking about other subjects such as social studies and science and math and even physical and visual arts, and how we need to build students' background knowledge so that the information we're teaching has something to adhere to. And the other piece of that is that equity piece, and how students, when they come to school, they come with very different levels of background knowledge, depending on their home lives, depending on their lived experiences. And we know that students who come from low-income homes are going to have more limited background knowledge and lived experience because of financial constraints, because of other reasons, and maybe because they are not read to as much at home as those who come from more educated, affluent families. So we want to make sure that we are doing what we can to level the playing field and to build students' background knowledge in a very intentional way. And one of the best ways to do that is by focusing on certain content areas. And so if we're learning about I actually hadn't thought about a certain subject area, but if we're thinking about science and we're looking at precipitation, we need to make sure that we are building their background knowledge, but also their vocabulary. They need to understand that vocabulary in order to understand and to comprehend the subject area and to build their knowledge. And so I came back from the conference, and I think literally that night I bought Dr. Willingham's book, Why Don't Students Like School? And he did mention it at the conference, and well, he promoted it very well because I went home and I bought it. And it basically says, a cognitive scientist answers questions about how the mind works and what it means for the classroom. And so again, this isn't a book that talks about what students need to learn in terms of the components of reading and writing, but is how can we maximize our instruction in order to maximize their learning outcomes? And so he talks about instructional practices, research-based instructional practices, such as retrieval practice and interleaving, which is teaching something and then coming back to it in blocks throughout the year. And I often think about mathematics because our units in mathematics are usually taught in chunks, and we don't often come back to them until the end of year assessment. And at that point, it's been about 9.5 months since students were first introduced to, angles, let's say. And the other thing that I really wanted to explore, and part of the reason I bought this book, was because in your podcast, as well as in his keynote address, he talks about the difference between performance and learning and how they're not the same thing. And how sometimes when we teach something, we're doing it with a goal in mind, and that's for them to pass the test. And sometimes kids are very good test passers. I don't know if that's actually a term, but they're very good at passing tests. But that doesn't mean they've learned it. Sometimes it's just there in their short-term memory, and then it's gone. So when they progress to the next grade the following year, it's almost like they haven't learned it. And we see this so much in school. If we have a good curriculum, and here in Ontario, we have a much better language curriculum, it really should be cumulative and grow that knowledge. But if a certain topic or a certain skill isn't reviewed and isn't interleaved, I don't know if that's a word either, but I'm making up words as I go. If it's not woven throughout the year and it's just taught in September, that teacher the following September is going to have to review what was taught the previous year for them to build this new knowledge on. But if we use the interleaving, we have lots of retrieval practice, then we're actually going to make learning more effective. And we're not just focusing on performance and saying, oh, they got 85% because the teacher the following year may beg to differ and say they don't know it. Well, they performed well, but they didn't learn it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love this because, we hear about the science of reading all the time. And then I do hear some people who are like, there's also this thing called the science of learning that we need to make sure we're also talking about that in conjunction with the science of reading. And I think the things you're talking about that are in this book, I would consider these are the science of how people learn, right? Just how your brain learns. And if you don't, can I make one recommendation for another book that goes along with this one?
Well, as long as you don't make the recommendation for the drink to drink with it, because I've already planned
we're
that.
fine with that.
No,
Melissa, go ahead.
Just another book. So I read this other book, and when you brought this one up, it made me think of this one. It's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. And it talks about a lot of those same things you mentioned, the retrieval, the interleaving. And so if you're really into this and want to learn more about it, there's 2 recommendations for you.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say my neighbor who is also a teacher friend in my neighborhood. I just looked at that book a couple weeks ago. She had it on her counter and I flipped through it. It looks really good. Make It Stick.
Yep. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a catchy title too. Well, and it's interesting because, as you know, I'm a French immersion teacher and I'm teaching French as a second language. And every single year, I ask my students, do you know why you're learning in French? And the answer is because my parents want me to, right? But when do we explain to kids why we have decided to choose a second language school for them? So, I think sometimes as teachers and well-intentioned parents, we have these goals. We want our children to be successful readers. We want our children to be able to write a covering letter for a job. That's why writing is important. We want our students to be able to maybe go on to post-secondary, and we want our children to maybe learn a second language, but we don't share those goals with the kids, so they don't know why they're there. So I feel like sometimes sharing those learning goals with the students and explaining to them why this is important and making it meaningful to them will also help make it stick. Because when I'm teaching math and I'm teaching angles, I know what my learning goals are. It's for them to learn it, but if they don't have anything relevant for it to make it relevant to them, it's most likely not going to stick.
That's right. Okay, so we're going to read Why Students Don't Like School. We are going to listen to that episode 139 with Daniel Willingham, which I agree, Kim, it is an awesome pairing. It really just listening to Daniel Willingham, I could listen to him all day. He is brilliant, and he just makes it so easy to understand. So little plug there for that. And you know what's coming, Kim. What are we pairing with? What beverage are we pairing with these as we
Well,
listen and as we read?
I mean, I do love Prosecco. It is typically my go-to summer drink, but I also love a nice cold pint. And so I personally like the Belgian wheats. They are, have a little citrus note to them. So yes, I would say a nice pint with your Why Don't Students Like School?
Okay. So we're going to
Pint
go
with Dan
pints with that.
Willingham.
There you go. We'll just send this episode directly to him so that he can hear. Yeah.
Well, she's like, I hate beer.
All right, Kim, we're ready for your last pairing recommendation.
Okay.
Can't wait.
I love this book. I was going to say I saved the best for last, but I actually can't say that because all three of them are based on very different content areas,
Mhm.
right? We talked about 3 books that focus on very different topics because I'm always trying to grow my knowledge and understanding of different areas. But here in Ontario, in February 2022, so over 2 years ago, we had the Ontario Human Rights Commission release a report called The Right to Read. And it essentially was a scathing report saying that Ontario is systematically failing to meet students' right to read. And it provided 157 recommendations. And a lot of those recommendations focused on what they called foundational skills of learning to read, which primarily focused on phonemic awareness and phonics and those decoding word recognition, those bottom strands of Scarborough's reading rope. But I wanted to really draw the importance to the language comprehension strands because they are equally important, if not maybe arguably the actual foundation of learning to read. Because when students enter school, they typically have oral language skills to some degree or another, and it's very broad in terms of the skills they come to school with, but they come to school with those oral language skills and some knowledge of language comprehension, whether it's following instructions or being able to express the fact they need a drink of water before they can decode print. So I decided to pick up this book called Read Alouds for All Learners, and it's written by Dr. Molly Ness, and the foreword is by Dr. Natalie Wexler. And I decided to pick up this book for my next read for a couple of reasons. Number one, because in Ontario there has been so much emphasis on the phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, and phonics that I thought we can't let the pendulum swing one way and not let it with disregard to the other multiple strands. And to be honest, teaching students to decode is, in my opinion, a lot easier than teaching the strands of language comprehension because language comprehension is so complex and in a way it's infinite. You can't possibly teach all vocabulary words. Can I teach all letter sound correspondences? Absolutely. There are 44 phonemes in English. Yes, it's finite. Whereas, how do I build students' background knowledge to a point of I'm done? You don't. And so I first listened to your podcast and it wasn't that long ago. It was episode 170, all about Read Alouds, which was, and your guest was Dr. Molly Ness. And I immediately bought her brand new book because I wanted to better understand how to make the Read Alouds in my classroom more intentional. Because I think sometimes Read Alouds are seen as a way to fill in time. Oh, well, we've got 7 minutes until recess. I'm just going to pick up this read aloud and
Just like
read
a
it to
nice
you.
extra thing to do.
It is, and it is lovely. But in the classroom, how can we make it more intentional? How can we align it specifically with those strands of Scarborough's reading rope? And I am a very structured to a fault. I understand this is maybe to a fault. How does this align with Scarborough's reading rope? What are my intentions? Why am I reading this read aloud? And do they know what those learning goals are? So when we are choosing our read alouds, it should help develop students' background knowledge in a certain content area that we are maybe focusing on in science. And that's the other thing, that read alouds don't have to just happen during literacy block. Read alouds can and should happen during math, can and should happen during social studies, can and should happen during science. And there are so many great books such as, what is it, Miss Frizzle's Magic School Bus. Great books to read aloud in a science class. Sorry, Lori.
And Kim, no, it's fine. I just wanted to point out too, can and should happen pre-K through 8. Like,
That's
or
right.
I would even say birth through 8. Or, I mean, honestly, read alouds happen infinitely. I listen to books, right? Isn't that a read aloud?
Yes.
I mean, it's not exactly in the way that we would say it here, and Molly Ness would say it, because we're planning for that read aloud. But I mean, you know, pre-K through 8, for all intensive purposes, birth through grade 8. Yes, like read aloud, have this read aloud experience where you're pausing and you're intentionally planning for your stopping points. I think that's the gist of it, right? Yeah.
And what's really interesting, and I don't have the page marked, but she actually outlines in the I happened to come across it. Of all surveyed teachers, 64% read aloud to students, elementary teachers 83, middle school 53%, whereas in high school only 36%. So as students get older, we are not using read alouds as a means of teaching those language comprehension. And we would hope that once students get to high school or middle school, or even grade 4, that they have those word recognition strategies secure and consolidated, that they can decode unfamiliar words. They have that sight word recognition of familiar words. But that language comprehension, like I said, is infinite. It shouldn't stop in the early years. It should continue throughout the older grades as well. And from a second language teacher's perspective, it is so important to sort of leave your own unconscious bias at the door, because our early language learners, so students in kindergarten through grade 3, don't have the vocabulary to fully understand and comprehend the read aloud. So we need to pre-teach some of those vocabulary words, have some visuals, refer back to them, review them, so that when you are actually reading the read aloud, they understand. Because we may have that bank of vocabulary words in our head and think, oh, this is such a brilliant story. Why aren't they enjoying it as much as I am? But if they don't know 50% of the words, they're not going to have that enjoyment of the book. So we need to really focus on those intentional teaching opportunities. And Molly Ness also talks about pre-reading the book and how to select an appropriate book for a read aloud too. It's not just, okay, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, okay, I'll read this one to them. It should be intentional. We want to align it with what we're already teaching, because then students may have some background knowledge for this read aloud to stick to. And we also want to use this opportunity to grow their vocabulary within that, so that they have not just that breadth of vocabulary, but they have that depth of vocabulary as well. And this book provides some amazing templates. Again, we don't have time as working teachers to reinvent the wheel. So she actually has planning templates in here. And they are scaffolded with her 3-step process, which is evaluate. What's the background knowledge? What are the funds of knowledge, or those funds of knowledge she refers to as those cultural norms. She uses the example of the laundromat in corduroy. Not all students may know what a laundromat is. And then she talks about that second step, which is the explain, and then the third step, which is engage and extend, and what are some meaningful activities that we can do around that read aloud. And I did just re-listen to that podcast that she has, 170, and how she emphasizes the activities should be literacy focused. And yes, coloring, a bookmark is cute, and we shouldn't say that shouldn't happen. And I think she used the example of Halloween, and it's okay if you color a pumpkin, but really, what are the intentions? What are the learning goals of this particular activity? And I think it's just really trying to make everything we do in the classroom intentional, and thinking about what are my desired learning outcomes for these students.
Yeah, and I will say, I was a middle school teacher, so I know that middle school teachers are probably like, no, I cannot do a read aloud. That's not what I do. That's for the younger grades. But she gives such great examples in here with that planning that you talked about. She tells them, like, here are ideas for a science class in 6th through 8th grade. 3rd through 5th grade. Here are some different strategies that you would use for that grade level or your content area. So it's really, really helpful for all teachers, especially if you're not comfortable doing read alouds. This would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And it is such a fantastic time to spend with kids too. Actually, connecting the two books, Dr. Willingham talks about the bond, the emotional connection between teachers and students as helping to improve student learning outcomes. And you may have a really funny teacher who teaches, with a lot of jokes, or you may have a very structured teacher with, a very structured approach. But really, it is that connection between teacher and students that is really going to help improve student learning. And read alouds is our great way to build that connection, because then you can engage them in conversations to get to know their interests. They're going to feel valued and respected if you ask them a strive for 5 question, for example, and have that talk in turn. They'll think, oh, Madame Lockhart actually wants to know how my parents do the laundry, back to the laundromat thing, or whatever. But I think the read aloud, when done with an intentional purpose, can be a great way to strengthen that teacher-student connection.
Yeah, I think that the read alouds are such a great shared experience. That's something that always stuck with me. As a 5th grade teacher, I felt like we all were having this shared experience together. Even if it was informational, we were like, oh yeah, remember that diagram that helped us better understand whatever, but we all had that experience together. And so then it did build that connection and that rapport. So I totally agree. I think it's really helpful to build that connection with your students.
Well, and I'm going to age myself for a second here, because I'm not sure if your listeners, if they're a lot younger than me, they may not know who I'm talking about. But I remember as a child, maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, my mom would read to me Amelia Bedelia. And
I loved Amelia Bedelia.
And I still do.
But I didn't understand half of it, but I loved it. She was so silly and funny. Yeah, but now as an adult reading it, do you get it?
Totally. But also for our multi-language learners, when you say she's going to dress the turkey, of course, when mom or dad or grandma says go get dressed, you think putting clothes on it. So Amelia Bedelia puts a dress on the turkey, or draw the curtains, and she gets out her notepad and she starts doing a sketch of the curtains. And it's really great for teaching those metaphors, especially for our English language learners. When we use these expressions, they may see it literally, whereas the Amelia Bedelia books help to teach students the not so literal meaning of certain terms and expressions.
Yeah.
The figurative.
Thank you. I was missing that word. My vocabulary. Anyways, can I quickly because I love read aloud so much, I just wanted to highlight a couple of my favorite read alouds that I read to my own 2 girls. One is called Bog Baby. I don't know if you've read Bog Baby. So great.
No.
So beautifully written. It's a fictional character, but it connects to the imagination of kids, and you talk about, well, what might you find when you go to the pond? And another one of my favorite books, I'll be honest, I'm more of a dog lover than a cat lover, but Tabby McTat by Julia Donaldson. I don't know if you know Julia Donaldson at all, but she's the author of The Gruffalo. Another amazing book, and it has a lot of rhyme in it. And then as my girls got older, we started doing chapter books for read alouds. And I actually, circa 1977, have my version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh my goodness.
And so, of course, I was reading that one, as well as Freckle Juice by Judy Bloom. So anyways,
Good one.
It's just such a great way to spend time with your kids, but also your students in the classroom.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because this weekend, Presley was going to babysit for a family in our neighborhood, and she was like, I want to pack a little bag of books and games so that I can read to them or whatever. And so we went downstairs into the bin and got out some of her books that she loved when she was younger. And one of them was Hecate Peg. Do you all know that one?
I don't know that one. Hecate Peg.
Hecate Peg. It's Hecate Peg. She's lost her leg. They let her in. And it's so good. I read that book every day, probably for years. But like, there are books that just amazing for read alouds, because you're teaching so much more than, and that those are the books we want to pick, right, for our students. I think that's Molly's point. You want to be intentional with your students? I mean, obviously it's a little different as a parent, but yeah, I'm so glad you shared. Melissa, do you want to share a favorite read aloud with Elliot?
Yeah, well, right now we are plowing through the Bad Guys series. Do you all know that one?
Yes.
Oh.
He's just loving it. But I would say the one that we read over and over and over again was If You Give a Mouse a Cookie.
Oh, yes.
Oh, my
Always.
goodness.
Those are great ones. Yeah.
It was like every night for a year.
But what's really interesting is seeing the progression of stories. I mean, we started with very simple stories, Julia Donaldson, lots of rhyme, Dr. Seuss, lots of rhyming. And then before I knew it, we were reading Summer the Swan and Holes and, of course, Harry Potter and the Percy Jackson.
Harry Potter with him.
Oh, it's honestly, it's a highlight of our day together. Whenever I say goodnight to my own two girls, we say, what was your rose, what was your bud, and what was your thorn? Rose being the highlight of your day. Rose, bud, what are you looking forward to? And what was your thorn? Maybe something disappointing. And almost every day they say, Mommy, my rose was reading the book, da, 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 da. And then it just starts a conversation. I'm like, no, it's time for bed.
It is true though. You do. I do think it's that same idea. You build those shared experiences, right? And I think it also allows you to speak in a different language, especially if it's a book where you're immersed in a different language, like Harry Potter. Or
yes.
I'm thinking recently we read The Giver and then The Hunger Games, so kind of paired those dystopian society, texts together. But those were texts that were very complex, and you could read again and again and have different understandings at different ages along your life. So I just think that there's a lot of opportunity here with read alouds, both in the classroom and teachers who are not working this summer in the States. It's great to practice at home, practice with your kiddos so that you feel even more comfortable when you head into the classroom in the fall.
Well, and I almost forgot about this one point. Really want to highlight how read alouds don't just help with reading comprehension and language comprehension, but they help with writing too. And I think we have to remember that students can't write when they don't have anything to write about. And so if we have an engaging, interesting read aloud, we talk about it, we go deep into it, and then we ask a writing prompt, students will have a lot more to write about than if we just ask them a blind question that we've just pulled from thin air. Write about what you did on the weekend, which has its time and its place. But if we're writing, if we read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and then we talk about some of the key points in that book, and then we give them a writing prompt, they're going to be a lot more excited and have more to write about than if we didn't do the read aloud ahead of time.
I think Dan Willingham would agree with that too.
100. All right, so should we do our pairing for read alouds for all learners? What is our beverage pairing? And it has to be different, I think, than the last two.
And start with P. I'm just kidding.
I don't know, Melissa. I was like, that's a lot of pressure.
Well, it actually does, because I love Prosecco. I do love a good cold pint on a hot night. And my favorite white wine is Pinot Grigio. So podcast and Pinot.
Oh, you're a white wine. Okay.
Yeah, I like the white wine. I don't want to go.
I was going to go for something like tequila or something like a nice
I'm not
fresh
sure how
margarita.
far I'd get through. Well, I'll be honest. I lived in Mexico for 3 years. I took a liking to good tequila, but after a couple of tequila, I don't think I'll finish the read aloud.
Yeah, the read aloud might go to the wayside at that point.
I think you'd have to do the read aloud and then celebrate with your tequila, not have your tequila while you're reading the read aloud, because you might not get to the end.
All right. So our top recommendation, our top takeaway from this entire podcast is to do your beverage pairing after you've already read the book and done the strategies.
If you can. It doesn't always work that way for me, but yes, do the best you can.
Don't do the read aloud with the tequila.
Especially when you're putting your 5-year-old to bed.
No. Well, we are so glad that you came on the podcast, Kim, to hang out with us, to talk with us about these podcast pairings, these beverage pairings. We had so much fun, and we know our listeners will love this episode and grab these books and start reading this summer.
Well, thank you so much. I do have some podcast pairing infographics that I can share with you that people can find online. And I really, truly am grateful that you invited me back. Thank you so much, and have a fabulous summer.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you. You too.